Bueno, bueno, muy buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar esta séptima conferencia que vamos a desarrollar en inglés. Voy a cambiar a hablar en inglés porque nuestro conferenciante está en San Francisco y va a tratar un tema relacionado a estos. Espero que todos estéis bien, como siempre, en este proceso de desconfinamiento que estamos y que todo os vaya bien. We are going to switch to speak English. I think I would like to give my thanks to Fereidoon Sioshansi. I think he came to Spain many times last year and the year before. He has scheduled to stay here. At that moment, it was impossible, as you can see all around. No? We have scheduled to have with him this conference about variable generation, flexible demand, the California experience, but we asked him to talk about some experiences about this COVID-19 in California. As you know, California is for us a reference because more or less the same population, and we always see California at a tower for us in the future. Now, this is why we are very ready to learn from her the experience in this variable generation, flexible demand that could be a sign for the future. Thank you for staying here. As you know, our system for this conference is a steering presentation for our guests. After this, you can send your questions to openly in the chat. You can send privately to Pablo de Juan. All of you know him about this. You can ask whatever you want about this topic, the variable generation. You can ask whatever you want, and our guest, as you know, he is, I'm going to introduce him I'm going to give him the floor before that questions and asking questions. Well, Fereidoon Sioshansi, he came here 2 or 3 times, I think, last year and the year before. He is president of Menlo Energy Economics. It's a consulting firm based in San Francisco. He has more than 35 years experience in the electrical sector. He worked in Southern California Edison Company in electrical power research, EPRI, and he worked with NERA. He is a regular contributor in several areas. He's a publisher. He puts out a newsletter called E-Energy Informers monthly. He has publishing many books, some of them with the contribution of Spanish writers too, all about this area of behind the meter, the utility of the future of utilities, the prosumer, the variable demand. How can we achieve the result not just by generation, but demand? And this is the topic we are asking him to present here. At that time of pandemic, we asked him to talk something more about the COVID-19 in California. Ferry, welcome here to San Francisco. No, this is something you can put on the back, the Golden Gate. This is normally a figure we can see all around our Zoom session, and the floor is yours. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for arranging the webinar, and it's a beautiful sunny morning. I know you have your afternoon, and for us it's early in the morning. And let's see, I'm trying to advance this, and it looks like it just locked up on me. What happened? Presenting to you. Okay, great. So let's go to the second slide, Laura.
Laura, try advance. Okay.
Thank you.
It's
okay,
working.
There we go. So maybe when things get better, I'll be able to come back to beautiful Madrid and do a seminar in person. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll give you a quick rundown before we get into the flexible demand topic, just the overview of what's happening in California. And I think the short answer is it's pretty much the same as what's happening in Spain. We have a lockdown, no travel, no restaurants, no interaction with other people. But life goes on, as you can see. So I'm here, you're there, and we're talking. So that's the good part. And I think the lesson in the fighting this virus is very similar to what we have to do with climate change. It's a global problem. Every country has to do its own, but I think we need to collaborate to fix the problem eventually. So I think there's some lessons. And if we go to the next slide, there are two particular websites that I have listed here, both from the California ISO, and you can, for example, the first one, you will see today's outlook. And right now it's a sunny morning in California. If you look at that particular website, you'll see the solar beginning to come on. I'll show you a slide of that, actually. Maybe next one. Yes, next one. Go back one. That's the chart from March, the beginning of the lockdown. And you can see this is the net load on California ISO. And if you go to the website in the previous slide, you can actually see the real one. But what is happening is in the morning, as the sun comes up, as you well know, the net load begins to drop, and that's the belly of the duck. So that's all solar energy in the middle of the day, and then the evening, as the sun sets, you get that peak, the neck of the duck. Now, people want to know what has been the impact of the pandemic, and in California, it's been something like between 5 to 8% during the weekdays and less on weekends. And you can see kind of from the shape of the curve, we still have the problem of the ramping in the morning and afternoon. And if anything, things have gotten worse because the load is lower. The sun is not lower. The sun is the same, and we have less load, and therefore we have more issues with curtailment. If you look at the next slide, if Laura can go to the next slide, you see the experience for the last few years. These are monthly curtailments, solar curtailments, and you see the data for 2019 and the first few months of 2020. So that's how much solar energy the California ISO has to waste, essentially, because it cannot store it, because it cannot export it, because there's no demand. And that's one of the issues that we're going to look at is, can we fix some of this issue by using flexible demand? In other words, can we, for example, charge electric vehicles during the sunny hours of the day so that you don't have to curtail so much solar energy? The next slide also shows a similar trend in a different fashion. It's the same information. And you see the last few years. Last year is the red, and this year is in the black. And you can see we only have data for the first few months, but the curve for 2020 looks very steep. So this year, and the fact that we have less demand will mean that curtailment will become even more of a problem. So we are dumping a lot of zero carbon, zero marginal cost solar energy during the sunny hours of the day because we cannot use it, we cannot store it, we cannot export it. And right now we don't have flexible demand to soak it up. And that's one of the topics we're going to talk about. So if we move to the next slide, I give you the background for the seminar today. And basically, you might ask, well, why are we talking about variable generation? Well, variable generation is because sun comes and goes, as I showed you. Why we talk about flexible demand is that we are trying to figure out a better way to use that solar energy in the middle of the day so that we don't have to waste it. And why California? Because as Arcadio mentioned, California is facing these issues perhaps more than some other countries are, and maybe there are some lessons for Spain, and we can discuss this at the end of the seminar. So you might say, well, why are we talking about this particular topic today? And the next slide explains that the topic of the webinar today is in fact the topic of my next book project, which you can hopefully order in about a year from now. And actually I have, I think there are 2 papers from Endesa, and there's one from David Robinson. So we have at least 3 chapters from Spain, specifically looking at these issues from a Spanish background. And for those of you who are not familiar with my publications, if you go to the next slide, there are some of my titles going back to 2006. The first one on the top left of the screen, and some of the other titles over the years. And the next one is the 5 most recent topics. Laura, can you go to the next slide? There we go. So Arcadio mentioned these are the most recent topics I've covered: distributed generation, consumer, prosumer, and behind the meter. So the next one, as I said, is maybe the natural that I'm now focusing on flexible demand. So once again, if we go to the next slide, let me repeat why we're talking about flexible demand and why it's such a hot topic. The reason for this is what this curve, the famous California duck curve, is all about. This was a study done by the California ISO in 2012. And they published this, and it became quite famous right away. And what you can see is it looks like a duck, obviously, and you can see the actual net load in 2012 is the first one, the first curve on the top. And then you see that the projection was every year, the belly of the duck would get bigger and bigger until by 2020 you hit whatever it shows on the graph. And the grid operator looked at this graph and said, wow, you know, we have 8 years to prepare for this, because by 2020, we're going to have these daily ramps where in the morning we have to reduce all thermal generation to the bare minimum because we have plenty of sunshine. And then as the sun begins to set, we have to ramp up. And the projection was something like 13 gigawatts of ramping capacity in 3 hours, which is what you see the neck of the curve. And also you can see that the peak demand in California, at least, is driven primarily by air conditioning load, and it happens later in the evening. So this became the famous California duck. And the question, of course, is, if we go to the next slide, was the California ISO correct in panicking when it started to worry about this? And the answer to this is very much so. In fact, the ramping, they thought that they would have 13 gigawatts by 2020, and by this began to happen much earlier. We got the 13 gigawatt ramp was experienced in 2016. Last year, the peak ramp in the afternoon was 16 gigawatts. And some of the problems, of course, are increasing renewable curtailment. We get negative prices more often and for longer periods. California is building a lot of storage, but there's not sufficient storage today, and so forth. So you know what these problems are. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you again what actual problems are. This is an actual chart from California ISO, and you can look it up on the website if you like. But basically, this is in January where our days are short and there's very little air conditioning because it's cold. And you can see what happens during the short winter months. The California ISO has to begin ramping in early afternoon, like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and by 6:22 or so, it experienced this, the peak demand happens at 6:22 on that particular day. And you can see on that chart what happens. The solar energy, which is big in the middle of the day, disappears. So it goes from, whatever it is to 0, and you have to replace it with natural gas or with imports from neighboring states. So this is the numbers for an actual day in 2019. If you go to the next chart, you see the projections for 2030, assuming that California continues to build more solar and more wind and so forth. And you can clearly see the chart here. The orange portion is the solar energy in the middle of the day, which comes and goes. So that's the variable generation in the title of the presentation. And why we need flexible demand, frankly, is you have this daily feast and famine. You have a feast in the middle of the day, lots of solar energy, 0 cost, 0 carbon, wonderful stuff, but too much of it. And then in the evening, after the sun sets, you have famine. And in this particular chart, the bar on the blue bar shows what the projection might be for 2030. So 10 years from now, the ramp in the evening might be as big as 25 gigawatts, not 16. And if you go to the next slide, you can see why this is a problem, because on many days, the solar is contributing quite a bit, but it varies depending on the clouds and so forth. Some days it might be as much as 70%, some days it might be less than 10, 20%. And the variability is what California ISO has to worry about. And I can show this to you in the next slide. It shows a typical week, which is the one on the left, and then you see a cloudy week. And so you can see that in a cloudy week, the solar contribution can be very minor relative to a regular week, if you will. But even more worrisome is what happens if you have 1 or 2 weeks where there's no sunshine at all, for whatever reason. There's clouds and rain, and you have to make it up some other way. On the other hand, if you go to the next slide, this is information that I've already mentioned to you, but it's shown in a different way. Basically, it shows you how much renewable energy, particularly solar, is being wasted, if you will, as much as 5 gigawatt hours per day. And this is the data for last year, so we don't have the full data for this year. And the situation is usually worse in the winter months and in the spring. And the reason for the spring is that spring in California is very sunny, but it's cool. So you have a lot of sunshine and no electricity, air conditioning demand. And the next slide shows the experience in all of America. As you know, we have marginal pricing in many nodes, and that's what this curve shows. And the blue dots are essentially negative prices, And you can see some in California, but quite a few in Texas. And where the blue dots are is the wind generation, which is far from the load centers. So Texas actually experiences more negative prices because of restrictions on transmission system. And the next slide shows that. It shows the data on quarterly basis. Laura, can we go to the next slide? It shows quarterly data for 2015 to 2018. I don't have the data for the more recent, but you can see that in Texas, and the Texas is pretty much driven by wind, but you can see that the numbers are almost 7% for 2018. I don't know what it is, what it was last year. So if you move to the next slide, the issues that California is beginning to, that California has had to deal with for many years are now beginning to happen in other countries. For example, South Australia is having its own duck curve. They probably call it something else, but you can see the dip in the net load on a daily basis. And the next slide shows a similar pattern emerging in Italy. If we can go to the next slide. And the pattern is very familiar. You essentially get a net load where, sun and the wind dip during certain hours, and then you have the peaks and you have the shoulder periods. And the question is, what can we do with this daily feast or famine? And that's where variable generation and flexible demand comes into play. So in the next slide, I basically show you why this is a multifaceted problem. It's not a single issue. You're talking about the daily cycles. You're talking about seasonal cycles from spring to the summer. You're talking about overgeneration, which is getting worse. You're getting about negative prices, curtailment, the issues of reliability and security and so forth. And frankly, these are all issues that we are very much facing on a day-to-day basis here in California. And what are the solutions to these problems is listed in the next slide. First and foremost, you obviously need flexible generation because of the ramping that I mentioned. And right now we are doing a lot of that ramping through natural gas-fired power plants, which can ramp up and down. But California is planning to phase out these natural gas-fired plants over time because we're trying to decarbonize the electricity sector and everything else. So today we can rely on the natural gas, but it's not clear whether we can continue to do that in the future. Storage, of course, is a big variable, something people are excited about, but storage works quite well with today's technology, mostly for the daily variations in demand, and it's not helpful for interseasonal issues. And there's other things you can do, build more transmission, things of that nature, but I'm going to focus primarily in the next few minutes on flexible demand and what we can do with flexible demand. And if you go to the next slide, I think maybe we can skip that one. That's a particular issue with California's market, which is trying to expand its footprint by bringing diversity from different resources from neighboring states. And this is something called energy imbalance market, but there's not enough time for us to talk about that. So let's move on to the next slide. And this one is from Europe. It's actually a study done by Euroelectric. And it's looking at the future where the electricity sector in 2050 for Europe, with all the policies in place. And you can see what happens with the daily solar generation. Those are the yellow peaks that happen, every day. And it obviously is, these are gigantic variations, but there's fairly short duration. So storage and maybe flexible demand can help you get through these daily cycles. And if you go to the next slide, you see what I'm talking about. So basically, the challenge is to take some of that middle of the day and move it to the shoulder periods so that you can alleviate the peaks. So the daily cycles can very much be handled with increased flexible generation, as well as storage, as well as flexible demand. But the problem is the interseasonal, which is what's shown on the next slide, again for Europe. This is the study that I mentioned that was done for 2050 for Europe as a continent. And again, you see there are months of the year where you have more generation than load, and then there's seasons where you have deficits. And it's very hard to move something like 25,000 gigawatts from spring to summer, as is shown in this graph. And the next slide from the same study for Europe shows the problem. The short-term problem, something like 350 gigawatt hours, can be helped or addressed by batteries, pumped hydro, and demand-side flexibility. But the interseasonal is much more challenging, as cannot be solved easily. Okay, so the next two slides, just pictures, nothing particularly to talk about. This, of course, is the famous battery in South Australia that Tesla built. It's a 100 megawatt battery that's turned out to be extremely useful to balance the load. The next slide shows what a private customer can do in the garage. You buy 2 or 3 of these Tesla Powerwalls, and it allows you to store your excess solar generation and use it later in the evening. So after all this background, let's talk about flexible demand and why are we not having as much flexible demand as we would like to have. And I'm conscious of time, so I will focus on 3 issues that have plagued the power industry for many years. The 3 questions on top. The excuses that we couldn't do more flexible demand has always been, we don't have smart meters on every customer. We don't have smart prices. And what we really need is smart prices to smart devices, which then produces smart, which means flexible demand. Some of those problems have been solved, but when you talk to people who are trying to do flexible demand in a profitable, marketable way, they will tell you that there are additional problems, particularly if you try to do flexible demand with small residential and commercial customers, because there's too many of them with small loads, and you have to aggregate many before you produce sufficient amounts of flexible demand. So next slide really talks about the key questions, some of which are addressed in the book that hopefully will come out about a year from now. Some are research questions, some are technical questions, some are policy questions, some are regulatory questions. For example, what applications can we find in typical households that has flexible demand? And if you look at the next slide, here's an example. Here's a simple electric water heater. it has a storage tank. So if you have millions of electric water heaters, which countries like France has, you can store the energy during the sunny hours and use hot water when you need it. Electric vehicles is another example. So technologies with flexibility built in them are already available. Water heaters and electric vehicles are prime examples. And in case of electric water heaters, as the next slide shows, if you do this on scale with millions of electric water heaters, this is data from France, you can actually change the shape of the daily load curves over time. Another source of flexibility, which is shown in the next slide, is demand flexibility in the industrial segment of the market. If you go to the next slide, you see examples from ERCOT, which is the Texas market, and you can see that fluctuations in price produces incentives for industrial customers to switch operations during certain hours and therefore avoid high demand charges and things like that. Next slide shows a study that was done by the Brattle Group for US, and I don't have enough time to go through the details, but the bottom line is that they think that the cost-effective flexible load potential, if all of it can be in fact used and aggregated, might be as much as 20% of the load. So this is a hypothetical study. It shows the data for potential for 2030. It looks at US as if it was one integrated market, which is not. So this is a very hypothetical case, but it shows you the kind of numbers that people crunch when they look at these types of studies, that there is significant amount of flexible demand, whether you're talking about Spain or US or Australia or whatever. Next slide gives you some examples of what you can do to actually generate or aggregate flexible demand. And I refer to a symposium that was held in Florence in February, which I attended, and there was a number of other people as well. For example, there was a presentation from NLX, and the example that stood out was a particular pulp and paper manufacturing company, Kimberly-Clark, which has a load. This is a facility in Canada, in province of Ontario. And this particular plant has 7 megawatts of demand. And when NLX initially contacted this customer and said, we'd like to work with you to bring about, take good use of your flexible demand, the plant operator said, no, we don't have any flexible demand, and we have to operate 24/7, and our load is 7 megawatt, and that's the end of the story. But as NLX began discussions with this particular client, they initially said, okay, maybe half a megawatt of the 7 is in fact flexible. But after discussions and negotiations and experimentation, NLX found that something like more than 5 megawatts of the 7 was in fact flexible. In other words, some of the heavy electricity using devices or processes could be cycled during the peak hours of the day, and that would save tremendous amount of money for the customer, for the grid operator, and would reduce cost of operating the system for everybody else. So these are examples of what you can do, but of course every case is different, every country is different, And there are other examples which I'm not going to dwell on other than giving you the overview. If you go to the next slide, this is a slide from NLX. This is a big global company. I know they're very active in Italy and Spain and the rest of Europe. They claim to have over 6 gigawatts of demand response or flexible demand from 15,000 sites worldwide. And the slide shows where the major facilities are. The point of this is it takes a lot of effort, as the example of the Kimberly-Clark plant in Canada shows. You have to contact individual customers, whether they're large or small, figure out what they do, where they use electricity, and how much flexibility they have. And then try to encourage them to bid some of that or make some of that flexibility available to the market operator somehow. And that's why we need these aggregators who can do this job, companies like NLX. The next slide shows an example which is not this very complicated graph, but all I want to show, this is a company in France called Voltalis, and they manage about 1 million electric water heaters in France, and they can adjust them. And to make a very long story short, you basically need devices, you need a platform, and you need sophisticated software, because if you're dealing with 1 million endpoints, you won't be able to do this manually. And the next slide shows what a typical exercise with the industrial customer looks like. You know, when you try to approach an industrial customer, the industrial customer is interested in electricity cost reduction. But as this chart shows, there's staff cost, there's storage cost, there's total process cost. And so if you try to reduce electricity cost and it ends up increasing your staff expenses, then the customer is not happy. So at the end of the day, there is flexibility, of course, in electricity usage, but you have to do a lot of analysis, a lot of analytics to identify where are the savings, where is the flexibility that actually makes sense, and then utilize it. And the next slide, which you will not be able to see or read the details, basically shows, this is an example from Germany that was presented in Florence. And basically you have to do a lot of analytics. You have to figure out where the loads are, what are the costs, what is the flexibility, which devices can cycle for how long during which hours of the day, and basically iterate and experiment until you get this correct. And the next slide essentially shows you a typical industrial process might start at a certain time and shut down, and people go home, and that's before you start utilizing the flexible demand. After you do the number crunching and analytics, you come to the next slide. And here you see the industrial customer cycling its heavy using the electricity devices during certain hours. Maybe that's the belly of the duck. So when there's this feast and famine, which most systems are going to experience, with more variable generation, you're going to have feast and famine. So customers who are clever and perhaps are helped by an aggregator who can cycle their intensive use during hours of the feast and avoid the famine periods, end up saving money and helping the grid operator and the other customers. So my last slide, which I want to have hopefully a few minutes for question and answer, is stating the obvious. I mean, the first obvious is around the world, whether you're talking about Germany or Denmark or Italy or California or Texas or South Australia, we are adding more variable generation to the network. and you see these headlines, 60%, 70% of the load is served by solar or wind. This is a reality. It's happening everywhere. Faster in some places than others, but it's happening. The second obvious thing is balancing this feast and famine. Daily as well as inter-seasonal is very challenging today, as I showed you the California ISO, and it's going to get worse. California wants to have a carbon neutral state by 2045. So things are going to get worse. What are the options? As I said, there are many options. Every one of them has limitations. Storage is a wonderful option, but you cannot store energy in spring and save it for 4 months and use it in August in California. We just don't have that kind of technology today. Maybe someday we will. So the bottom line, which is maybe an exaggeration of what's happening, is, historically, and I've worked for Southern California Edison for 11 years, so I know this from past experience. Historically, when I was in the industry, we always we forecasted the load and dispatched plants to match it. That was the way it was done. Daily, seasonal, weekly, whatever. In the future, I think things will get completely turned around. We have to start looking at what is the variable generation tomorrow. How much sun, how much wind, how much geothermal, how much hydro are we going to have? And then try our best to use it wisely. In other words, we have to figure out a way to dispatch load to match generation. So it's a 180-degree departure from the historical pattern. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I think we should have more than 10 minutes or so for questions. And I don't know, Pablo, you're going to ask, or Arcadio, who are you going to do the questions?
Thank you, Ferry. I think there are some questions, and Pablo has another one here. No? Pablo, go ahead.
For you, Fereidoon. Some have to do with flexible demand and some don't, but I think we'll be able to answer them. You were saying that California ISO saw in 2012 what was going to happen with the duck, and that they were panicking. You use this word. What did they do in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, to try and solve this issue that was coming up to them?
Well, they did panic, and they realized that this was not just a technical issue, but a lot of regulation and policy had to change. So I wasn't involved in the details, but I think they went to the governor, they went to California Public Utilities Commission, which is our regulator. They went to the California Energy Commission, which is the state agency that does the policies. They went to the utilities. They publicized this in the press. They said, we have a problem, and it's getting worse. So as you saw in the duck curve, in 2012, when the initial study was done, the belly of the curve was not there. It was still middle of the day. There was still, a lot of load. But they saw the net load dropping, and in 2012, they didn't know how they were going to do this by 2020. But among other things, California started adjusting its net energy metering laws. The regulators imposed a mandatory storage requirement, which utilities had to invest in. They were interested in variable prices, time of use rates. California has a mandate to have 5 million electric vehicles by 2030. So by some estimates, if you have 5 million electric vehicles and you charge them during the sunny hours of the day, that might give you something like 13 gigawatts of storage. Mm-hmm. Now, don't quote me on that number because there's a lot of fine print in that number, but you can store. So all of these things that I'm talking about, the fact that we need to develop more flexible demand became widely known and recognized.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So policy was changed, regulation was changed, new tariffs were introduced, all kinds of things happened, and we are doing it as we go.
Okay. There are 3 questions concerning hydrogen. They ask you if you think it's a winner solution in terms of levelized cost of electricity, if it's not better to produce hydrogen instead of going into complex, flexible demand systems. Yeah, and in general, how do you see hydrogen in the present tense and in the short and medium term?
Okay, there's 2 short answers to that. One is, what can we do today or in the next, say, 5 years, and what can we do in the next 10 years and beyond? Hydrogen, I think, is not something you're going to come up with. It's like carbon capture and sequestration. It's not going to happen in the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. Eventually, we're going to need it, and eventually somebody will figure it out. So part of the answer is we are dealing with this today. 16 gigawatts of ramping is happening here today. In fact, today may be one of those days because it's very, very sunny and reasonably cool. Mm-hmm. So there are solutions for today. Hydrogen is not happening today, as far as I know. But eventually, we will need something that would be able to, that seasonal variation that I mentioned is very critical. So whether it's hydrogen, whether it's pumped hydro, or some other, green hydrogen, people talk about this. For example, Australia is thinking about developing an industry, essentially, that instead of exporting coal, which is carbon intensive, they want to export solar energy to China or India or whatever. How are they going to do that? So hydrogen may be a solution. You can, if you look long-term, hydrogen, a lot of people think that's, we have to figure out a way that we can store. You cannot put that kind of energy in batteries and store it for 4 months. So we're going to need new technology, and hydrogen is definitely on the agenda.
Okay. Continuing with technologies, they're asking you what's the future of thermal solar plants versus PV? And with such a flexible market, electric power market in California, is it profitable to maintain nuclear plants? And what's your view on nuclear plants in the near future?
Well, thermal versus PVs, this story has changed because there was one time that people said thermal solar is dead because cost of PVs is so much lower and PVs don't need water. In places like California, we don't have water. So one reason solar is so attractive is it doesn't need water. But now, because of the storage issue, the fact that sun sets at 6 and the peak demand is at 9, solar with thermal storage, CSP, or some variation of it, actually makes economic sense. Because some of that free sun in the day can be stored in something or another, molten salt. And that allows you to serve the peak at 9 p.m. That's extremely valuable. So people, I know some investors in California that lost interest in CSPs are now thinking that it might have the future. So we will have to, I think the jury is out on that. Now the question with nuclear, the nuclear is, at least in California, I can tell you that we have only 2 remaining reactors. Diablo Canyon, that belongs to PG&E, my utility. They are not flexible. And when PG&E looked at the duck curve into the future, essentially they saw no future. So both of those plants are coming out of service or going out of service in 2025. Partly because what California needs is flexible generation, not baseload. And nuclear, because you have this minimum load issue, you cannot cycle down nuclear plants in the middle of the day. So I don't know if that answers your question. Certainly in California, I think we're going to have no nuclear plants after 2025, unless there's a change in that. And nobody else other than Southern Company that is building 2 nuclear plants. Nobody else is even thinking about building nuclear plants.
Okay.
So it's one of those unfortunate things because, you know, nuclear is carbon-free. It's a proven technology, but there is, you know, because of financial situation, it just doesn't seem to be viable.
Okay. There are also a couple of questions concerning security of supply. One asks that if eventually gas peakers will phase out, how will the required inertia for the grid to be secure? How will it be secure? They're asking you about artificial inertia, and then they're also asking you if in terms of distributed generation, how can it affect security of supply?
Excellent questions. The debate about the peaking plants in California has been going on for a while. Right now, companies like Calpine, a lot of those peaking units in California certainly are merchant generators. And because those plants are only used infrequently, only for a few hours, they're not actually super profitable. During many months of the year, they're not utilized very often. But ISO essentially pays them to stay online. And we have this continuous debate. You know, the regulator revisits this issue, what to do and when do we phase out the gas peakers. Mm-hmm. Every year when that question comes up, they delay it. They want the peaking plants to remain on the network because of the concerns about this daily ramping situation. So there is a trade-off. I think there's the question, you know, if you don't have any peaking gas-fired plants, you have to have either more storage or you have to have, well, you have to have a lot of extra sun, solar energy, extra wind, extra geothermal, extra hydro with lots of storage, with lots of flexible demand. So theoretically, you can balance supply and demand, but it will cost you orders of magnitude more. And there are studies. There was a study done by E3, a consulting company that I can provide the information. There was a study done for California in particular, looking at 2 futures, one with 0 natural gas peaking plants and one where something like 50 gigawatts of peaking plants would remain on the network. And the cost differential was significant. So the answer to that question is, you know, if you don't want any peaking plants, 0 carbon electric system, you can have it, but it'll cost you a fortune. I think that's what most studies suggest. And as far as distributed generation, you know, the future in many parts of the world, there is, people are developing these small energy communities which are semi-independent of the grid. So there's a lot of debate whether the future will be lots of aggregated small loads managed locally and not dependent on the grid very much. But once again, if you have, say, 2 weeks of no sunshine, many of those energy communities will not be able to survive. So once in a while, we need the big grid. We need the reliability, and that reliability sometimes comes with thermal generation, like peaking plants and things like that.
Okay, a couple of more questions. One of them has to do with the cost of flexible demand. And it says, with PV prices coming down so much, it wouldn't be just okay to curtail PV generation without damaging the investment? And how this curtailment cost would compare with the cost of flexible demand? There was also another question concerning cost of flexible demand. And then another question has to do with energy prices, energy rates. So they say in Spain, the fixed part of energy prices are higher than 50% in small consumers. So it's pretty difficult to transmit flexibility and energy efficiency to demand. So from your point of view, how should energy prices be structured?
Excellent. Again, excellent questions. The first part of the question, PV. Okay, let's say we have a lot of solar energy and we end up curtailing it. Is that an issue, or we get negative prices? You know, some people would say, so what? It's not costing us anything. And if that's what it takes, we will curtail it. It's kind of like having the opposite system where we had in the past. We had gas-fired peaking plants who sit idle for many hours of the day, right? They were only used, you know, there are peaking plants that are used 100 hours a year. That's the equivalent to curtailment. We're not using them, right? So some people, I mean, this is a philosophical argument. One argument is there's nothing wrong with solar energy being curtailed. You know, okay, 6% of the hours, we have more sun than we have load. So what? It's not the end of the world. And prices go negative. So what? That just encourages people to charge their electric vehicles in the middle of the day. So it ties down to your second question about prices. I think prices can play an important role. If California, in fact, has 5 million electric vehicles by 2030, which is the plan, and some people say we might actually overshoot it if it weren't for the pandemic. You know, right now nobody's buying any cars, period. So we don't know when electric cars come back to the market. But assuming that we have 5 or 7 million electric cars, as I said, that may be as much as 13 gigawatts of flexible storage. So if prices are right, and yeah, once in a while we would have some solar curtailment. So whoever asked that question, it's a good question. I think, you know, the reverse question is to ask, today's system in, say, Poland, or I don't know, some country that doesn't have a lot of renewables, they have many plants that sit idle most of the time, except for the peak periods where everything has to be more or less up and running. So essentially we have an equivalent version of curtailment in these thermal-based systems. So now we're going to a system where, because of the variability of sun and the wind and so forth, we're going to have some curtailment during certain hours a day. As far as prices, again, that's a very big, this is a $64,000 question. How are we going to support the big grid and the little grid, the distributed systems of the future, and the fact that we're still probably going to need, you know, some transmission and distribution to spread things around and so forth. How much of that is fixed cost? How much of it is variable cost? And what kind of tariffs do we need to pay? Who's going to pay for what? Because at the end of the day, it's all economics. Somebody's got to make, you know, everybody's got to make enough money. Whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's flexible demand, whether it's peaking plants, whether it's storage, it all boils down to prices, doesn't it? And economics. So that's why it's an interesting problem. That's why I'm probably going to do another 3 or 4 books just trying to cover these interesting issues. Every time you start looking at the problem, you find some answers, but you find far more questions than you find answers. And I think some of the questions that people are asking are excellent questions.
Okay, Arcadio, there are more questions. I don't know if you give me a couple of more.
Maybe you can ask the last one for him. We finish here. Maybe you could answer a short answer to go
on what does this, what's the role of biomass, of thermosolar, of smart meters, of what else? There are many dealing with that. I mean, what's the different roles of different technologies and in balancing markets, in flexible demand? So that's I'll ask you this one last question, which is like 5 altogether.
Short answer,
Right.
Ferry.
Okay, excellent. Well, it's, I think one of the slides I mentioned, there's no silver bullet, as we say. There is not, it's not like I can say, build nuclear and solve all your problems. You know, some people say that. Just build a lot of nuclear plants, it's carbon free, it's base load. Okay, you know, that's one way, but there's no silver bullet. You need all of the above. You need good markets at the wholesale level, you need good markets at the retail level. You will have to find a way to finance it. We still need a grid. Not everybody's going to be self-sufficient. We need good prices. We need good policy. And people in this business need some clarity. Nobody's going to invest unless we think we're going to make money. And right now there's uncertainty. Nobody really knows, you know, which way is up. So everybody's trying to do things and nobody knows for sure what's going to work. Is hydrogen the answer? Is thermal storage the answer? Is electric vehicles the answer? Is the duck going to get worse? Or no silver bullet. We need all of them. Thank you so much. These questions were excellent questions. I really enjoyed them.
Okay, Ferry, what is the lockdown over there in San Francisco? This problem with the beaches, or we saw in TV?
What is the role of what?
The lockdown.
Oh, lockdown. You know, things, people have gotten used to it. In the beginning, it was very odd. And after a month or so, you kind of get used to it, you know? So you can go for a walk. I live near a trail. I can actually go out and try to avoid getting too close to people. So nobody goes to restaurants or.
We watched some news about the beaches and the use of the beaches and the governor.
Yes, there are. You know, the problem is it's an externality. You know, it's not. I mean, if you don't care about the virus, fine, you can go and get sick. But if you get sick, you know, I might get sick. No, not only that, I might get sick. You know, so. You know, if it was like smoking, you smoke, you do damage to your lung. Yeah. I stay away from you. But in the case of the virus, you could pass it on to me. So anybody who's not careful becomes a danger to everybody else. I think that is the problem. You know, so there are some people who say, I don't care and I'm not going to get it.
I understood you can walk around, you can go out of your home for walking. And
yes, you can go for shopping, you can, you know, you can go for medical emergency, although everything is very slow nowadays.